July 12, 1943. 0247 hours. North Atlantic. Approximately 340 miles west of Vigo, Spain. Captain Lieutenant Eric Wordman, 29 years old and commander of the U-506, stands in the conning tower of his Type IXC submarine. The sky is pitch black. There is no moon. The conditions are perfect for surfacing to recharge the massive battery banks. Wordman is an ace. He has sent 15 Allied ships to the bottom of the ocean. He knows these waters like the back of his hand. He knows that on a night like this, ink-black and starless, Allied aircraft are virtually blind. But what Wordman doesn't know is that 9 miles away, a B-24 Liberator music rises from the Yuzov 1st Anti-Submarine Squadron has just painted his boat on its SCR-517 microwave radar. The pilot, music intensifies First Lieutenant David Buck Miller, is 24 years old and a veteran of the hunter-killer patrols. He is cruising at 500 feet, throttles pulled back to minimize engine vibration. In the bomb bay, he's carrying a lethal payload of Mark 47 depth bombs. But the explosives aren't the most critical piece of equipment on board. The most important weapon is mounted under the starboard wing of the massive bomber, a 70 million candle-power carbon arc searchlight. And that light is about to change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic forever. If you want to discover how a simple beam of light became the weapon U-boat commanders feared most, smash that like button. It helps us declassify more forgotten stories like this one. To understand why this searchlight was so devastating, you first need to understand the crisis the Allies faced. During the early years of the war, German U-boats dominated the Atlantic with terrifying efficiency. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships. That is more than 4 ships every single day year-round. Admiral Karl Dönitz Music, commander of the German submarine fleet, had perfected the Rudel tactic, the Wolf Pack tactic. U-boats operated in groups ranging from 8 to 20 submarines, swarming Allied convoys from multiple directions simultaneously. But Dönitz's tactic had a critical weakness: energy. The Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats, the workhorses of the German fleet, were hybrids. They used diesel engines for surface cruising and electric motors for submersion. However, the electric batteries only lasted for about 60 to 80 nautical miles at cruising speed underwater. This meant every submarine had to surface for several hours every day to run its diesels and recharge the batteries. During the day, surfacing was suicide. U.S. Navy and Army patrol planes blanketed the convoy routes. A surfaced U-boat was a sitting duck. But at night? Night was different. At night, the U-boats could surface with relative impunity. Aircraft couldn't see a steel-gray tube against the black swell of the Atlantic, or so the Germans believed. What Dönitz didn't realize was that Allied scientists had developed airborne radar capable of detecting a surface submarine from up to 12 miles away. The SCR-517, an American improvement on British cavity magnetron technology, operated on centimetric wavelengths. It was cutting edge, but it had a fatal flaw. It could find the sub, but it couldn't guide the final kill. As the B-24 closed in on the target, the radar return from the submarine would get lost in the sea return, the radar clutter caused by waves near the aircraft. Pilots called this the minimum range or the dead zone. It was the final 3/4 of a mile before the target where the radar went blind. In that dead zone, the pilot had to attack visually. And on a moonless night, attacking visually meant missing. Operational records from 1941 show that out of hundreds of night attacks initiated by radar, almost none resulted in a confirmed kill. A success rate of barely 1%. The German commanders knew this. That's why they preferred to surface on moonless nights. That's why Wordman was on the surface that night in July 1943. But the game was rigged against him. The man who changed the equation was a British officer named Humphrey Daverd Leigh. In 1940, Leigh proposed an idea that his superiors initially laughed at: mounting an extremely high-intensity searchlight on a bomber to illuminate U-boats in the final seconds of an attack. The Americans adopted this concept and supercharged it. They didn't just want a light, they wanted a supernova. The engineering challenge was immense. The searchlight had to be powerful enough to light up a submarine from a mile away. It had to be aerodynamic. And most importantly, the timing had to be flawless. Music: if the light triggered too early, the U-boat would crash dive before the plane arrived. If it triggered too late, the pilot wouldn't have time to adjust his aim. The margin for error was measured in heartbeats. The U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces deployed massive carbon arc searchlights, often mounted under the wings of B-24 Liberators and PB-4Y-1s. These beasts produced up to 70 to 80 million candle power. To put that in perspective, imagine 80 million candles burning in a focused beam, all at once. The protocol for the attack, known as the Leigh light attack, was a dance of death. The pilot would approach the U-boat guided strictly by radar, flying dangerously low, between 200 and 300 feet. At about 1 mile out, just as the submarine vanished from the radar screen into the dead zone, the radar operator would shout the final heading. The pilot then flew blind for approximately 15 seconds. At a quarter mile from the target, the co-pilot or bow gunner flipped the switch. In that instant, millions of candle power of blinding white light turned night into day. The U-boat was lit up like an actor on a Broadway stage. The pilot had between 4 and 6 seconds to adjust the yoke, line up the nose, and toggle the depth bombs. For the U-boat commander, those 4 to 6 seconds were a nightmare. A Type 9 boat needed about 30 to 45 seconds to crash dive from the surface until the conning tower was submerged. In the first 15 seconds of an alarm, the boat was barely moving. It remained a perfect, stationary target. The math was brutal. From the moment the searchlight blazed to life, the German captain had exactly 90 seconds to make a life-or-death decision. If he ordered an emergency dive, the sub would be shallow, perhaps only 30 or 40 feet down, when the hydrostatic fuses on the American depth bombs detonated. At that depth, the hydraulic shockwave of a 300-pound Torpex charge was lethal. Hull plates would buckle like tin foil. If he chose to stay on the surface and fight it out with his flak guns, the aircraft held the high ground. The blinding beam destroyed the German gunner's night vision, while the American pilot could see every rivet on the deck. 90 seconds. That was all a U-boat commander music had between the flash of light and the shock of annihilation. Let's go back to the Atlantic. July 12, 1943. 0251 hours. Lieutenant Miller is in the dead zone. The blip of U-506 has just vanished from the scope. The radar operator calls out the final vector. In the cockpit, the tension is suffocating. On the bridge of the U-506 music, Wordman suspects nothing. The Atlantic is silent. No engine noise can be heard over the wind. His lookouts report clear horizons. Suddenly, at an altitude of 200 feet and range of 400 yards, the B-24's searchlight activates. A beam of pure, coherent white light stabs through the darkness. The U-506 appears out of nowhere, its gray hull glistening wet against the black water. Wordman takes 2 seconds to process the horror. He screams the order. Alarm. Flu 10. Alarm. Dive. Sailors on the deck scramble for the hatch, sliding down the ladder in a panic. The ballast tank vents roar open. But it is too late. Miller releases a stick of Mark 47 depth bombs in a lethal bracket pattern. The charges are set for a shallow detonation. The U-506 has barely begun to settle by the stern when the ocean erupts. The depth bombs bracket the hull. The hydrostatic pressure hammers the submarine. Welds snap. Lights shatter. The pressure hull cracks. Water jets into the compartments. The U-506 loses buoyancy control. Wordman has no choice. With chlorine gas forming and the batteries flooding, he cannot dive. The submarine wallows on the surface, mortally wounded. Miller banks the massive 4-engine bomber around for a strafing run. But before he can open up with his .50 caliber machine guns, the Germans are abandoning ship. Of the crew of the U-506, few will survive the war. But on this night, the B-24 has won. The U-506 sinks beneath the waves. It had survived exactly 26 minutes from the moment the radar first painted it. But the U-506 wasn't the first, nor the last. The introduction of the searchlight turned the hunter into the hunted. The statistics tell a grim story for the Kriegsmarine. Between mid-1942 and mid-1943, Allied aircraft equipped with searchlights destroyed dozens of U-boats in night attacks. The success rate of night engagement skyrocketed from that abysmal 1.1% to over 17%. That is a lethality increase of nearly 1,500%. But numbers don't capture the fear. The most devastating impact of the airborne searchlight was psychological. For the first time in the war, the German crews could not trust the dark. War diaries recovered from captured U-boats reveal the terror the light induced. One commander wrote, "The night no longer belongs to us. Every time we surface, we wait for that light to find us." Admiral Donitz tried to adapt. He ordered U-boats to stay submerged longer, recharging batteries during the day when they could spot aircraft from a distance. But this drastically reduced their speed and operational range. He ordered the development of the Naxos radar detector to spot the centimetric radar frequencies. But the searchlight itself emitted no electronic signal. It was just physics. Light. By the time you saw it, you were already dead. Finally, in desperation music, Donitz issued the fight-back order. He commanded U-boats to remain on the surface and engage attacking aircraft with their anti-aircraft guns rather than diving. The logic was, if you can't run, you must kill the attacker. The results were catastrophic. On July 20th, 1943, the U-558, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Gunther Kreck, attempted to fight it out on the surface when illuminated by an Allied bomber, a liberator from the 19th Anti-Submarine Squadron. Music Kreck ordered his gunners to open fire. But the blinding intensity of the searchlight dazzled the German crew. They were shooting blindly into the glare. The American pilot, however, had a perfectly illuminated target. The Liberator strafed the deck with .50 caliber fire, decimating the gun crews, before dropping depth charges with surgical precision. The U-558 was blown apart. The order to fight back on the surface was rescinded weeks later. By then, over a dozen more U-boats had been lost trying to follow it. By the end of what Germans called Black May 1943, the combination of the searchlight, centimetric radar, and U.S. Navy hunter-killer groups had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard for the U-boat force. In that month alone, 43 U-boats were destroyed. That is more than one sub per day. For the first time in World War II, the German loss rate exceeded their ability to build new boats. On May 24, 1943, Donitz made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year prior. He ordered the withdrawal of all U-boats from the North Atlantic trade routes. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't over. The Germans would return with new technologies like the Schnorchel and the acoustic torpedo. But the era of the Grey Wolves' absolute dominance was finished. And it all started with a carbon arc lamp and a seemingly crazy idea to strap a searchlight to a bomber. The airborne searchlight remained in service with the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces until VE Day. Official records credit the device, directly or indirectly, with the destruction of nearly 50 Axis submarines. Humphrey de Leigh, the British inventor, received honors for his work, though his name is often forgotten by the public. Eric Wordman of the U-506 died later in the war? No, actually, nearly the entire crew of the U-506 was lost when she went down, save for a handful of survivors picked up by a British sloop days later. The story of the airborne searchlight is one of the great ironies of military history. A piece of technology as simple as a flashlight defeated the most sophisticated stealth machines of the era. It wasn't a weapon of mass destruction. It wasn't nuclear physics or a computer code. It was simply light, applied at the right time, in the right place. 90 seconds. That was all the time a U-boat commander had to bargain with fate once the beam hit the water. Most of them lost that bargain. Did you know about the role the searchlight played in breaking the U-boat blockade? What do you think about this technological duel between light and steel? Music. Leave us a comment below and subscribe for more declassified history from the Second World War. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next briefing. Every week, we bring you the verified stories that define the